Hello and welcome to English Language and Literature Book Club podcast. And my name is Sabrina. Today we're talking about Mary Shelley's famous Frankenstein, written in 1818. Even though it was written in 1818, the idea of this novel was born during her traveling with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron. Um, Around Switzerland, and one day they had a contest who could write the scariest horror ghost story. Even though back when the contest was happening, she came empty handed, 2 years later, some personal unfortunate circumstances and her life experiences inspired her to write this novel. And the premise, I think, actually differs a lot from what we know about the Frankenstein from pop culture. Because originally the Frankenstein is the creator of the monster who was a sickly Swiss student who was obsessed with the pursuit of knowledge and obsessed with the alchemy and the idea of creating a living human being himself, playing God in a way. And today, to discuss this fascinating, deep, very disturbing novel, we are joined with my best friend, the love of my life, the bane of my existence, Valerie. Hello, my love. How are you?
I'm good. Not sleep deprived at all.
We believe you.
Yeah. But Frankenstein comes first. So
Fair enough. Okay. Then please tell us, because I know you love this book, and I've never
mhm,
met anyone who loves this book as much as you do. So please share
mhm,
with us, what was your impression when you read this book, like for the first time consciously, already as an adult, not as a
mhm.
child? What was about it that haunted you and still haunts you pretty much to this day?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a very important point that you mentioned reading it consciously because basically it's really hard to, perceive this book and like my first impression of it without it being in my life since like the very childhood, because I think the first time I read it I was either like 9 or 10 or something like that, so basically like either a kid or like very early, like very young kind of teenager, so I think there's always like some deep sense of nostalgia that comes to mind when I think about it, but at the same time, I also read it, like I've reread it multiple times, and actually I think like the first time I came to realize the actual depth of the novel was when I read it during my first year of being, like a literature studies student and stuff. And I think it's really important to contextualize this, like the novel from, like the novel itself, and the way the image of Frankenstein is usually the way it usually works in pop culture, because you always
Definitely.
expect this, like it's a horror story, it's like something scary, something that's supposed to be like spooky, but when you actually read the novel and pay attention to like everything happening there, to the
Mm-hmm.
characters, yes, it's scary, and yes, it's like there is dread, but it's an existential kind of dread. It's not something that is supposed to be like, um like some cheap kind of just like jump scare kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
it's just like it's just much deeper, and it haunts you on a much deeper level than I think pop culture leads many people to believe.
Yes, definitely. Because in the book, honestly, the question is so open. Who is the monster? Victor
Mm-hmm.
himself or the creature that he created? Because, like, throughout the whole novel, and especially you mentioned when we talked about this book before, that there's a lot that we see and perceive from the perspective of the demon, how he calls him. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
guys, that Frankenstein is not the monster, it's the creator. And it, like, the whole book, you feel so much like empathy towards him, and it's just the lost child, and it's just like pure consciousness and a lot of confusion of my own creator being turned away from me. And I think that's the kind
Mm-hmm.
of existential dread that I think haunted people like after the first Second World War, like in relationship between God and us. And we see Mary Shelley putting that, but on a smaller scale in this novel. And I think it was like fascinating to watch, like really heartbreaking. and I've also read somewhere that she pretty much wanted us to see him as very human, as someone we can empathize with. And
Hmm.
Shelley, like the Shelley, the husband, a lot of his corrections were about dehumanizing him, making like the whole idea of like calling him demon devil. That was also his idea. So that's interesting that in her
Hmm.
like original conception, this was supposed to be a story about just that was meant to kind of like, spook you, be uncomfortable, but also kind of
Hmm.
break your heart.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting. It's not a very well-known fact as far as I'm aware, but basically there are two major versions of the novel,
Hmm.
and it was like one that was severely like in many ways it was like edited by her husband,
Mm-hmm.
and it changed the novel drastically. And like, yeah, you can argue that like in some ways it actually like I think the modern Prometheus, as
Mm-hmm.
far as I know, is his idea.
Mm-hmm.
The subtitle.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think like the original idea of the novel is much better expressed by the unedited
Yes.
version of it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, many people believe that Percy was the one who wrote the book for many years,
Oh yeah.
because yeah, yeah, because because he was like a more well-known author at the time and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and his name was in because he wrote the introduction for it. So basically, it was believed that he was the author, and she was actually unknown for I think quite sometimes, like a couple of
Yeah.
decades at least.
Yeah.
So
And even I think the first edition did not come out with her name in there. It was only the second edition, like
yeah.
2 or 3 years later, when they put her name
Hmm.
as an author. Yeah, and I think we
Yes.
have so many instances like that when it's novels that are written by women. But yeah, talking about Shelley and about their kind of like disagreement, I think it's really appropriate now to talk about kind of the context in which the novel was created, because it was
Hmm.
somewhere like at the edge between the Gothic literature and the Romantic literature at the time, like two very major influential currents. And I think a lot of
Hmm.
Romantic poets pretty much came from the Gothic literature and started out as Gothic writers. Like even Byron has some stories about like vampires.
Hmm.
And I
Well,
think,
actually,
yeah,
he stole the stories about vampires from Polydor, but that's a different story.
yes, also that.
Yeah.
I mean, Byron being Byron. And yeah, I think like what I've noticed that like yeah, we have the Gothic with the whole like morality question and the critique of the Enlightenment, because
Hmm.
the Enlightenment thinkers pretty much believe that okay, we can explain everything rationally with science and like
Hmm.
human feelings, emotions, the world, everything is explainable, everything can be studied. And Gothic literature was pretty much an antithesis to that. And a lot of it was about the supernatural, the things that are bigger than human, and about us battling with those things bigger than humans. And I think that is definitely a part of the like zeitgeist in which the Frankenstein was written. But also I think the romantic influence can be found in like in the moral questions, the moral battles that we see
Hmm.
here, and about this whole like looking for the sublime, looking for something bigger than myself, and all of like greatness, but also like the nature. And I
Hmm.
think we also talked about how like Anna Radcliffe and that kind of nature is very benevolent towards people, very cutesy, very Rousseau-esque. Meanwhile, nature
Hmm.
in Shelley, she's much more closer to the Romantics, who saw nature as something that can be frightening and enticing at the same time.
Yeah.
And especially like the Bon Plan and all of that, that's pretty much something that could be written
Hmm.
by a
Yeah,
Romantic poet.
definitely.
Yeah, but with the critique.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think the important thing to realize about nature and Shelley, and especially nature in Frankenstein, is that yes, it is meant to be perceived as something that is above people,
Mm-hmm.
above like human beings, and so it is meant to scare you in a way, not in a like again like not in a spooky kind of way,
Yeah.
but just in a way that you realize the greatness that is like so much above you that you can
Mm-hmm.
never reach it. And I think a lot of the book, and again, you mentioned enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, while the whole like world, the whole like human population was moving in this like all for progress, all for like moving forward, all of that kind of ideas, I think for Shelley, it was really important to like in her novel to raise the question of how do we stay human when all of this like progress is happening, and how do we not actually regress when we try to go against nature and when we try to go against natural law, and also like if we try to go against God, because that was also like a very important question for that time. And it still is, it's like one of those eternal questions, I'd say, in a way. So I think it's this novel, while raising all of these like issues of the the movement she was in, the time she was in, and all of that, I think it also tries to answer some of these questions about how do we find that point that we still stay human in a way, and we don't while trying to reach something better, something above us, we don't actually regress into complete decay.
Yes, I think definitely because I think she also kind of questions our human nature if we can handle that amount of power and that amount of just being on our own, having all this power over everything and knowing everything, and that's like very Faustian theme, and I think that is
Mm-hmm.
taken a bit of to the extreme. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and also like the darker parts of humanity, because yes, you can technically progress for as far as you can,
Mm-hmm.
but then are you open-minded enough? Are you brave enough to face the things that you create as a human? And I think that's here pretty much this relationship, this very like painful relationship between Frankenstein and his creature, this like parent child, but the parent, the creator, that turns away from you in disgust because he just like
Mm-hmm.
cannot bear the weight of what he has done and what he's created. And it's kind of like a shadow that follows him throughout his whole life that he just cannot
Mm-hmm.
be responsible for.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the idea of shadow is especially interesting in this book, because I think there was also something about just, the whole environment that Shelley was in. And it was like a very important question of like the, inner struggle and like dark side that people have, all of that, like psychoanalytical stuff in a way. But I think it's like, it's also, especially in Frankenstein, it's something that I think, especially for her time, it was basically not like never seen before, but it was definitely something very original. The way she puts like external conflict of, Victor Frankenstein and the creature that he created. And it's basically meant to, to emphasize the internal conflict that is actually happening. Because we can see the struggle of Victor, and we don't really see him. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you can share your opinion on that. I don't really see him as a villain. I don't see him as like an antagonist. You're
Yeah.
still meant to perceive him as like, yes, a human being that has done things that are wrong, but at the same time, he's still a human being, and yes, he makes mistakes. And I think in many ways we are supposed to actually empathize with him and see that the mistakes that he has made were not because of his like villainous, antagonistic nature, but because of the nature of human beings. That's what
Yeah.
we are meant to do. So since we don't really perceive him as this like cruel and evil person,
Yes,
um,
definitely.
we can see him just like going through a lot of like mental struggle and like struggle with what he had done, with like what he had created and all of that stuff. And in many ways, the creature actually functions as like a sort of like doppelganger, which was also like a very much used like literary device. And it's usually like in many cases it is just meant to. So doppelganger is basically the double of the of the person, of the hero, that serves as a death omen essentially. But also in many ways it is meant to show the inner struggle, so like the mental division that is going on within this person. And so in many ways we can see the Frankenstein's creature as a sort of doppelganger, but he serves as not really that much of a like direct, obvious double of him, but more of like an inverted mirror, you know?
Yes.
There is, for example, you know, when he's creating him, he sees him as something beautiful. Like he basically creates him after his conception and idea of beauty. But when he actually, you know, commits the act of like crossing this border between life and death, the beauty turns into like a decay. He's horrified by what he's created, you know, and in many ways they you know, reflect and contradict each other at the same time, you know. It's like, for example, there is this thirst for knowledge that Victor has, you know, the thirst that leads him to unimaginable facts of deeds. You know, it leads him to something that is, you know, trying to play God in a way. But it's, again, yes, it is, you know, in a way it can be like arrogance and self-entitlement and all of that. But it is also just, you know, it is in the nature of, you know, human beings to strive for something that is bigger. So he has this thirst for knowledge. And at the same time, knowledge is a concept that fascinates Frankenstein's creature
as well, because we see him like studying, reading books, and he talks a lot how that changed him in so many ways, how he sees a reflection of himself and helps him to understand the world. So I think definitely it's very like paralleled between each other.
Yeah. So like in many ways they're just like mirroring each other, but at the same time, you know, you can see that when you know, while knowledge leads Victor to trying to become God, knowledge also leads the creature to become more human. So, you know, in many ways it's like, yes, they're mirroring each other, but it also like an inverted mirror of sorts. So which, you know, it's like contributes to this idea of him being like his double and him being, you know, this like side of himself that is the darker, the inner side that he's trying to hide, you know. And it's also like the fact that he abandons him as soon as he's created, basically. I think it symbolically emphasizes this like trying to break away from your inner side, trying to break away from this inner conflict that you're having.
Yes, definitely. And also like when you mentioned how he thought him beautiful, that was, I think, was like he mentioned that he chose like the most beautiful like corpses and sites and parts to make him beautiful, but that and then he's like wretched and disgusting and horrifying. And then also reminded me how him discusses himself also as a child, how he is like a cherubic beautiful child, and like his parents could not get enough of him. And then as the story progresses, also he starts using the same words, the same epithets to describe himself also as wretched, as a horrifying, as a villain. So I think that's also interesting how even like on this level, they just reverberate each other.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's on many levels. It is just really interesting to see. Because we see Victor as a child, sort of. We can see him like growing up and like the context he was in, the family that he was in, and we see him in a very like loving context. You know, we see him with his family, surrounded by people. He had like you know, a very good upbringing, and then we can see like, you know, the creature that he's responsible for, and the well, not the lack of upbringing that he had in contrast. And so I think in many ways we can see again, maybe you can share like what was your what the way you perceived it, but in many ways you can see how the creature is portrayed as like being very childlike, you know,
definitely.
as being very, yeah, especially like in the beginning when he's before he turns into something more cruel and violent. He's very innocent, and like, you know, we always associate innocence with like
children,
you know, childhood and like being untainted by the world and all of that. And I think it's really interesting how, you know, you can never break away from this parallel between the creator and the creature and the parent and the you know, the child and all of that. So I think especially in the context of Mary Shelley's own life and the struggles that she had with motherhood, I think it's especially interesting to consider the novel in that context.
Yes, I think because in like when we think about her life, we both have this motherlessness, because we know that Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother and famous writer, she died 11 days after she gave birth to Mary Shelley because of the childbirth fever. So basically, she never got to know her mother, and I think this lack You can definitely see that in this like unbearable loneliness of the monster, but also her struggles as a young pregnant woman after she had um, her first miscarriage, and then her other two kids died, and she had these dreams, vivid dreams about her children coming back to life, but they were dead, and how that was
Mm-hmm.
horrifying. And the question, oh, can I love everything that I give birth to? And I think that's really piercing throughout the novel, and especially the connection of motherhood and a child and the horror. I think that's really, really closely related. And one of my favorite theorists, Julia Kristeva, in her book, The Powers
Mm-hmm.
of the Horror, she coined this idea of the object. And it starts from the idea of, well, the object is the mother's body is object to you once you go through the mirror stage, once you completely separate and you become a part of the symbolic order, once you gain speech. Um, you start understanding yourself as something that's separate, your own body, your own boundaries, and but before you were kind of one with your mother. That's how you perceived her. You came from
Mm-hmm.
her, but that starts to horrify you. That starts to disturb you. And she writes that the idea of the object, is mostly about the transgression of the boundaries. That it's not the lack of health that causes subjection, but what disturbs the identity, system, or order. That's
Mm-hmm.
which does not respect the body and positions and the rules. And I think that's really interesting here as the disturbing part of it, because she also talks about how the corpse is basically the epitome of the object, because that our body
Mm-hmm.
is the signifier of life, of movement, but that kind of escapes once you die. So you're the signifier for that which no longer is there, and that's scary. That
Mm-hmm.
what freaks us out. And I think here
Yeah.
we have that to such a high degree. It's like corpses that are then brought to life, and this like motherless figure that is
Mm-hmm.
seeking this lost mother.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting, one I cannot remember her name, but one theoretician, she also talked about how this quest for mother, and this like very disturbing quest for mother, also can be related to the romantic quest for the origin that also can never be
Mm-hmm.
found. I think that was a beautiful thought. But yeah, I think today, if we think about like good horrors that actually disturb us, this idea of the object is pretty much present there. And that's
Yeah.
kind of fascinating that Mary Shelley at the age of 18, 200 years ago, came up with that and just figured out how to make it work
Yeah.
to make us kings crawl.
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to mention, while you were talking about all of that, I was just thinking about how we had this like huge wave of like zombie undead kind of movies,
Yes.
maybe like 10, 20 years ago or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's just really interesting how, if we think about Frankenstein as, you know, um, in a way, the conception of horror in literature,
Mm-hmm.
something that has started the whole movement. It's really interesting to see how, again, 200 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
all of these elements that make us tremble, that make us scared, all of that, it was
Mm-hmm.
already discovered by Mary Shelley. Because the human psyche and the way it reacts to
Mm-hmm.
horror never actually changes. We don't
Yes,
actually,
exactly.
yeah. So, and like the triggers that people 200 years ago responded to are still the triggers that some movie directors very well
Yes,
adapt. So,
exactly. And I think it was so interesting and so complex, because if we look at the typical Gothic literature before her, it was a good heroine in the beginning. It was a
mhm,
chaste, noble heroine who is fighting against all of these dark powers, all of these like Satan impersonations, and it was never this transgressive, because here we don't have some Satan, we don't have any bad character that is trying
mhm,
to take advantage of the innocent girl or something like that. We have, first of all, a man in the center, and he is both the one who is corrupting himself, and it's just human nature. And I think That what keeps this book so interesting even after so many years. And I was
Yeah.
also thinking, but I didn't have time to mention that about the whole enlightenment and how our knowledge can, in the end of the day, lead to the decay instead of the progress.
Mm-hmm.
Because the novel is subtitled "The Modern Prometheus," and I
Yeah.
think it's really interesting to look at the image of fire in the book, because I mean, if we look at the myth of the Prometheus, that's the man who gave us fire, who allowed us to develop, to let us live. But in here, fire is so like it doesn't have just one positive connotation, because the first time
Mm-hmm.
we encounter it, it's a crazy thunder. It's really scary, and the way that we perceive fire as a sign of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's like an interesting inversion again that she came up with to show that yes,
Mm-hmm.
things are not just black and white, and it can, it's like very
Yeah.
complex.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting inversion of the myth in this case, because again, in the original Prometheus, so basically he defies God,
Yes.
gods in that case,
Mm-hmm.
to to help the humankind, to again, like bring this progress and all of that. And here we can see that the defiance of God can lead to destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's like, again, it's a very important point of that, like of the mindset of that time,
Mm-hmm.
is that what actually happens when you're left without God. And I think even in the 21st century, this question
Definitely.
of like, how do I find myself in there, even if it doesn't really matter if you've had like very religious upbringing,
Mm-hmm.
or if you've had like a completely like opposite of that. I think it's still like a question that
Yeah,
that we are meant to
lingers.
ask ourselves, if we ever think about like the loneliness of being, and all of that just leads us to question our own existence. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
existential dread is basically the epitome of Frankenstein.
Yes, and honestly, for both of them, because this whole like
Mm-hmm.
feeling of being left alone and the creator turning away from you, that's also
Mm-hmm.
definitely something that Victor struggles with towards the end, because we see that this whole book is basically his repentance with what he has
Mm-hmm.
done, and you kind of can almost sense the same loneliness, but at least with his monster, he saw his creator. He knew that his creator wished him to be dead, but as a human being, you don't have that. Your God is
Yeah.
silent.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting to mention that, one of the books that the creature reads when he's
Mm-hmm.
learning how to read, how to
Yes.
communicate, all of that, is actually The Lost Paradise by Milton. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, it's like, it's both interesting to see, just the way it works within the novel, but it's also interesting to just consider it in the way that, like Mary Shelley herself was growing up
Mm-hmm.
in the movement that was questioning God, that was
Yes,
questioning,
like
like, all.
Wordsworth was at their house very
Exactly, yeah.
often, stuff like that, definitely.
Yeah. So I think it's very interesting that one of the books that, like, the first book that he reads,
Mm-hmm.
is basically a book that portrays Satan in a more sympathetic way.
Yeah, and he
It's a
refers to himself as a fallen
mhm,
angel in the end. And he
yes,
thinks about how he's a fallen angel that is turned into a demon
hmm,
by the cruelty. I think like one of the quotes that really stuck with me, when he argues with Frankenstein, who just thinks him to be this wretched, vengeful demon. He tells him, "No, you're wrong. I am
yeah,
malicious because I am miserable and I'm lonely, and I that's the only way that I could survive.
hmm,
But it's all your fault that you did this to me." And I
yeah,
think there's also this like sympathy and this constant like attempt to, yes, this is something that we don't understand, we don't know, but I like for her choice to award him this humanity. I think that is really curious now, because a lot of Victorian literature, looking back, can be read as such interesting commentary on race and where we draw the line between human and what's not human. Also, the questions of gender, and a lot of topics that are quite prevalent in academia today. And I
Mm-hmm.
think Mary Shelley gives us so much material to work with when she questions our prejudices, our biases. And I think this whole post-humanist movement as well that we have today in academia, also in books, because like today we write books from the perspective of the trees,
Mm-hmm.
from the perspective of like, well, why is it so dangerous to or something humanity and to take humanity away from something else, especially for us as
Mm-hmm.
people, knowing the history, how easy it is to just negate someone's humanity in our eyes. And I think that's a very important book to keep rereading today, knowing the climate, the political situations that happen in the world. I think that's still quite a relevant book, even outside of the horror.
Yeah.
And I think we're kind of running out of time. Do you have any finalizing remarks, any comments? And then I think it should be a little tradition to read a little bit from the novel to make you
Mm-hmm.
guys more excited about reading it themselves.
Yeah. Well, the only thing that I really want to mention is that like definitely go and read the novel, but also there's not a lot of like many truthful like movie
Yes.
adaptations, but there is a coming adaptation from Guillermo del Toro that you might know from
The Pawn's Labyrinth.
the Crimson Peak, the Shape of Water. You know, I think if I had to choose one film director to direct Frankenstein, it would be him.
Definitely.
So I'm really excited. I hope it's good, and I'm really looking forward to it. So it's just something
Yeah.
to look out for.
Yeah, I honestly like since you told me about this, I'm constantly in my mind thinking about like at least once a day. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but hopefully we will finally get an adaptation that does justice to the depth of this book,
Yeah.
instead of just portraying the monster as just the monster and gives the
Yeah.
humanity that he deserves, honestly. And I'm
Yeah.
going to read you like a really small excerpt, maybe not that small, from the last section of the book. So this is the creature himself is talking, kind of like soliloquy. But it is true that I am a wretch. I have murdered the lovely and the helpless. I have strangled the innocent as they slept, and grasped to death his throat who never injured me or any other living thing. I have devoted my Creator, the select specimen of all that is worthy of love and admiration among men, to misery. I have pursued him even to that irremediable ruin. There he lies, white and cold, in death. You hate me, but your abhorrence cannot equal that with which I regard myself. I look on the hands which executed the dead. I think of the on the heart in which the imagination of it was conceived, and long for the moment when these hands will meet my eyes, when that imagination will haunt my thoughts no more. And there's like a little part that I'm gonna skip. Farewell. I leave you, and in you the last humankind whom these eyes will ever behold. Farewell, Frankenstein. If thou wert yet alive, and yet cherished a desire of revenge against me, it would be better satiated in my life than in my destruction. But it was not so. Thou didst seek my extinction, that I might not cause greater wretchedness. And if yet, in some mode unknown to me, thou hast not ceased to think and feel, thou wouldst not desire against me a vengeance greater than that which I feel. Blasted as thou wert, my agony was still superior to thine, for the bitter sting of remorse will not cease to rankle in my wounds until death shall close them forever. But soon, he cried with sad and solemn enthusiasm, I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pyre triumphantly, and exult in the agony of my torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace, or if it thinks, it will not surely think thus. Farewell. Also, this passage kind of remind me of also one point that I think I wanted to discuss about how like this painful relationship between him and Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, about how he needs him to be alive even though he seeks vengeance, and it's like one cannot live
Mm-hmm.
without the other, and that's honestly just was torturous to read. That even that
Yeah.
when the monster, this horrendous monster, when he thought that Frankenstein might lose will to live after everything he's done to him, he just
Mm-hmm.
found a way to get him angry, brought him food when he thought he might die in these scary Russian northern plains, just to keep him alive. And now that he's dead, we see that he
Yeah.
also kind of seeks to just fade away.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I think it's a heartbreaking passage, but it's just so beautiful that you
yeah.
cannot not appreciate it, you
Yeah,
know.
right? Like, guys, if you haven't read the novel, we highly, highly recommend it.
Yeah.
Just no book does it, no movie so far does it justice. So just
Yes.
give yourself this pleasure, read it in your own time. And thank you so much, Valerie, for being here tonight with us. Like your
My
input, as
pleasure.
usually, brilliant. And hopefully, we'll see you next week. Bye bye.
Bye.